Madam Vice President, hello. Welcome to Aix en Seine. Allow me first to introduce you. So you're the Vice Executive President of the European Commission. You are in charge of digital economy, competition, synergies between civil industries, defense, space industry. You also coordinate the works of the Commission on AI and also on taxing a digital economy. So when we read the intentions of Ms. van der Leyen, you have a very wide scope to cover, indeed. You used to be a minister in Denmark, but also commissioner for competition in the previous commission. So I'll start with a paradox that I'm sure you'll appreciate. You're very popular in France, even though you were in charge of competition in the previous commission. And you know that the French are always very attentive to everything regarding competition, and there's one mooted debate regarding a certain merger that we'll come back to. So how can we explain that you're so popular in France? Well, it's because in your as part of your mandate, you looked at abuse of dominant position of a number of operators in the digital economy, and you also looked into how we could tax those multinational operators. All of that has made you a wonderful person that the French admire for everything you've done. Now, what are the challenges for this new mandate of the Commission? You're one of the main representatives. How can we make Europe stronger in the world? That's the title we've chosen for this session. Can we agree to say that the European Union has been built on the basis of a progressive agenda? Freedom of movement for people, for goods and services, for capital, a certain number of shared competences. We've talked of competition, external trade, structural funds, and a certain number of EU acquis, or a shared body of law, that Europe has tried to export at its boundaries. Democracy, competition, rule of law. And faced with the economic crisis back in 2008, a monetary union. It's quite unique in the world, even though that's not always the way European citizens perceive it. But this building of the European Union is now in peril. And that's what I want to discuss with you, because of protectionism, because of populism, that is surging, because of health risks and the surge in nationalism that it has caused in some countries. And last but not least, because it's part of your mandate, technology and technical progress, which has made it possible for a certain number of players to have excessive power, or power that can be abused. The commission that you represent here, it's often been said, was the commission of last resort. If we do not tackle thoroughly a number of subjects, it might be very detrimental. So there are high expectations. A lot of people want more protection in a number of fields. And on all matters that we're going to discuss, I will ask the same 4 questions. First, what should we do? The second will be, what could we do? And you can sense the nuance, I'm sure. The third is, what are you going to do? Very simply. And the fourth, how do you intend to do it? I'm thinking of the consistency with the work of other vice presidents and commissioners. I'm thinking of Phil Hogan and Thierry Breton. So, first and foremost, high expectations about taxing the GAFA, as we call them, and how to inject more discipline in digital economy, how to better protect personal data. So on this first topic, what should we do? What could we do? What are you going to do? And how do you propose to do it so as to be consistent with the other commissioners?
That the first thing to do is to say thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for welcoming me to Aix. I've been looking forward to this for a very, very long time because even if I cannot be in X, a wonderful place, then at least to be together with important discussions still to come. So thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you. And just one thing to get sort of the premises right, because the Europe that we have built, of course, it is characterized with the four freedoms, but maybe more important, it is characterized by the European willingness to make choices. Because we have chosen to have a social market economy. It's a market economy, yes, but it's definitely not laissez-faire sort of neoliberalism. And the second choice that we have made is to build welfare societies. These are not perfect, these are not equal, but they are still so much better than what you see in so many other places in the world. And this is because of the interplay between our democracy and the willingness to set boundaries, and within these boundaries then say to businesses, now you go compete. And that is the fundamental, because in that choice also lays the conviction that the market should serve the consumer just as well as the society should serve the citizens. And that I find to be a particularly European idea. And we have now built this up for 60, 70 years. And these are consistent choices that we have made to improve the living conditions of the people who live here. And I think that is important to continue doing, also in a world that becomes increasingly digital. And to take sort of, I think, what is close to everyone, which is taxes. As they say in the US, two things are certain, death and taxes. To that, I would add tax avoidance. That seems as much as a given as the taxes themselves. And this is, of course, why we have work to do. Because many, many businesses, they work very hard just to make a profit, and from that profit, pay their taxes to contribute to the society where they do their business. And it is simply not fair that other businesses, because of their business model, because of the way that they create value, can leave that. And this is why we have been working so hard to create a global consensus about digitization, about taxing of digital companies. Because what we should do is indeed to make sure that we have tax justice. And what we can do is, of course, to make this happen. And now, unfortunately, the latest development is that the US have sort of quasi-withdrawn from the OECD debates. We will still push for this, but if we cannot make it happen globally, then, of course, we will pick it up to have a European response, which is also why I do appreciate that individual countries like France, like Spain, like the UK, are pushing in order to keep the momentum, because this is a very, I think, fundamental question of tax fairness. Would you want me to take the second part on technology as such as well?
On peut, oui, je pense.
Yes, why not? Yeah.
Because that sort of connects very closely to my first point, that the market should serve the consumer. Because here it's also, for me, very fundamental that technology should serve humans. We cannot have it that the individual, the citizens, feel that they are just, small bits of production in a giant digital space. And that sometimes is a feeling that you can have when you're just the one to deliver data into a big machine that then can be monetized, again, because of you. And we have quite some things to do, because one of the things that I learned from 3 Google cases, one Amazon case, a number of other cases, is that we can vigorously enforce competition law, but we also need to call in regulation, and we need new tools. And the regulation we need is to say to those who hold market power, those who are the gatekeepers to so much needed infrastructure, that if you have this position, then you have a responsibility. And part of that is to make sure that you do not promote yourself on the basis of others, which was basically the first Google case, the shopping case. It can be that you have to show some restraint compared to what a smaller competitor can do, because it has so much more effect if you're the big one. But also, since the last chapter is definitely not written in the digitization of our society, we also need to prevent new gatekeepers from arising. And for that, we need a new competition tool. So not only will we have to rein in the gatekeepers as we know them now, we also have to prevent new gatekeepers from arising to secure this fundamental that the citizen is in the center. And here I feel a very strong support from the European Parliament, from a lot of the business community as well. And I think civil society is also very, very focused on exactly this agenda. So we will, on the basis, of course, of public consultation, propose legislation late this year or in the beginning of next year. Christine, vil du sætte en lille grå pose i min grønne?
Le deuxième dossier tant
Ms. Vestager, the second topic that is important to us for, today, to see how strong Europe can be in the world, is what relates to competition policy. It's important to the French and the Germans. You, of course, are aware of the Alstom Siemens case. Competition policy is an old policy, if we can say that, because it's as old as the EU. And the world has changed since then, and most people agree that it might be necessary to clean it up, to reinvent it. So what are the main guidelines that you will be advocating for during your mandate?
Competition policy is not only important to France and Germany, it's important to all 27 members of our union. Because what it does is something fundamental. It allows businesses to grow and to gain strength if they are preferred by their customers, if they have affordable prices, quality, services, innovation. And that also, of course, goes for businesses in the value chain, so that every business who needs supplies from someone can get that on the basis of affordable prices, quality, innovation, and services. And that very basics of gaining strength is what has made Europe an amazing place, one of the richest places on this planet. And this is because competition is a challenge to you. And by accepting this challenge, you grow your skills and your competence. And this is why we have a number of European champions that has a good marketplace in the global marketplace. So this also means that you can acquire other businesses to acquire scale, to grow bigger, as long as you accept that you're still being challenged in the marketplace. Because if you're not being challenged anymore, well, then basically you can have whatever prices, you can let quality deteriorate, you can stop innovating without having customers, anyone to turn to. And that fundamental principle has sort of shown its strength decade after decade after decade. And yet, of course, competition rules will have to adapt so that this fundamental principle is still valid in the world that we live in. We need to make sure that everywhere the market is global, that we see and can assess a global marketplace, as we did in the Siemens Alstom case, where we found that it was a global market. It can be that in In other instances, we need to take better care because data plays a role where natural resources or monetary funds would otherwise have played that role, so that we keep seeing what is at stake in this marketplace. And this is why we have put out for consultation now the notice on how we see the marketplace in a merger assessment. This is why we have reviewed or are in the process of reviewing basically all our guidelines when it comes to state aid. And this is also why we have been asking, do we see all the right mergers? Because sometimes a company is not yet a company that has a huge turnover, but it has a huge potential. And of course, here we should assess it because there may be a data side to that case that is very important for the marketplace to stay a place where businesses, they are challenged to do their best when they are a supplier or when they are, for us, the final customers. And one of the things over history that has been tried and tested is, for instance, after the Great Recession, where in the US they relaxed competition rules. And I think by now there's broad agreement that this actually prolonged the recovery, and because of that also prolonged the period of time where people had to suffer from lack of jobs and lack of economic pickup. And now we are exactly in this situation where we cannot afford to prolong the recovery, because there is a huge risk right now, both that people socially will suffer if jobs are not being created, but also that Europe will be behind in a geopolitical competition, which is completely changed as to what it was 10 years ago. And that, of course, is reflected in the work that we do.
Oui, précisément.
Well, precisely. Europe and competition policy have sometimes been reproached for protecting consumers, but not protecting businesses enough. The EU has been sometimes accused of naivete in its opening a bit too freely its borders to competition. There's one topic in particular that sort of distorts the debate. It's the question of grants to foreign competitors who come to distort our market. There are rules, the WTO, but maybe these rules are not enough. Do you think that some significant progress should be made? How can we go back to a non-distorted competition? I know you have a white paper that is under construction. That is absolutely fundamental to protect not only consumers but producers in Europe.
That is indeed an excellent point, because when we ask fair competition of European businesses, then of course we also get an obligation to protect them against unfair competition. And one of the things that we have seen going through our rules and our different tools in our toolbox is that we did not have what we needed in order to address it if a foreign country pours in subsidies either for a European business to be acquired or to maybe pick up, which is the most harmful thing, sort of the operating cost of a business doing business in Europe, or in a public procurement process that businesses are not competing on fair terms to get the task that is up for public procurement, but is basically being able to bid with very attractive bidding because they have foreign subsidies on their books. And now we have a public consultation on a number of instruments to address exactly this. So, for instance, if a European company is being acquired, then you would have an obligation, if you do that with subsidies, to notify that. And then we would be able to assess, is this in Europe's interest or is it not? And of course, it can sound somewhat naive that you have to notify if you acquire a business with subsidies picking up part of the bill. But the thing is, if you do not live up to this obligation, obviously, there would come a procedural case and that would come with a fine. So, of course, it would have severe repercussions. but also a tool to allow us, if we see, because of complaints, because of what we learned from the marketplace, that some businesses get foreign subsidies, that we could investigate that and basically say, well, if knowledge has been created because of this subsidy, you'll have to share that knowledge. If infrastructure has been built because of this subsidy, that infrastructure will have to be shared. So we need to have a much harsher stand and a much clearer signal to foreign countries to say, you're welcome to do business in Europe, but you have to play by the rules. And also, in the last mandate, we modernized the trade defense mechanism to say, well, you should not come and dump your goods on our markets. That be steel, where we have, I think, more than 35 trade defense measures, because we cannot have it that you do not come with the right intentions. And last but not least, and that is a novelty, since we have thrown ourselves completely into fighting climate change. We have the target of being climate neutral 2050, and it's an integrated part of the European recovery that we will have a green recovery, that now is the chance not just to rebuild the old society, but to build something new, that we will establish a border adjustment mechanism so that only countries who are sort of part of fighting climate change and part of the measures fighting climate change, that we can trade with them fair and square. Because otherwise, of course, there is a high risk that European businesses, being part of fighting climate change, transitioning into using electricity or hydrogen or other measures, that they can still compete on fair terms. So we have a lot of things to do, because in protecting fair competition, of course, we will fight what we see of unfairness in the marketplace.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Last question to wrap up. The health crisis is acute, even though we've experienced an improvement in Europe compared to other parts of the world that have been hit later. About that situation, the EU has been active. There's a number of provisions and measures that were taken temporarily to prevent the free movement of certain medical devices. I'm not going to name names and name countries, but I think that's a clear example of what we shouldn't do. How do you intend to organize things better so that it doesn't happen again?
It was awful, because it was a situation where some countries who were hit first was hit very severely, and they asked for help with their neighbors, and their neighbors closed their borders and reacted with a ban of export to help out. That, of course, creates wounds that only heal very, very slowly, and that only will remain healed if we do better, both in solidarity when it comes to the recovery, that we help each other to recover together, but also that we learn from this. The European Union have almost no competence when it comes to health. But what we have learned is that it is extremely important to coordinate. Every morning we had a coordinating meeting. My colleague who worked on the borders to allow the trucks to travel, because in the beginning there were queues, 20, 40, 60 kilometers of queues with trucks who were carrying food, medical supply, all kind of stuff, with how to transition to make sure that industry produce mask, protective gear, things to sanitize, how to make sure that state aid was handed out very fast to help all the businesses who were to hibernate. And what we learned from that, of course, is that we need to be more precise to say, well, of course, we will immediately, if something comes back, be there to coordinate our actions. And we also need to have sort of a central stockpiling of what is needed in that situation, because we cannot just rely on third countries for that production. And we also need to figure out how to make sure that we are not dependent on a single supplier, that some of the essential molecules that goes into drugs needed, of course, with the COVID, we need new drugs, but we also need some of the very fundamental ones that are off patents, generic production. We need to be able to assess that also within Europe. So we have a full working plan of lessons learned in order to be able to protect ourselves much better the next time, because we learned a lesson. We also learned a lesson of the financial crisis. And one of the lessons here has helped us because the banks are in such a much better state that they have been able to work as channels to make sure that the aid could reach the real economy and all the many businesses who needed first liquidity and now to an increasing degree also capital. But the other thing we learned was that we reacted very late and maybe too weakly. So the social consequences of the financial crisis became deeper than what I think everyone would have wished they had been. And this is why it is so important that our heads of state and government decide fast on the European Recovery Plan, Next Generation EU, because that in itself is worth billions, that Europe can react, that we can react together, and we can build a strong recovery that allows us to transition into green, but also make the best possible use of digital technologies. And to show that leadership, I really hope that everyone will give our heads of state and government the encouragement to negotiate with one another and find agreement in this very month of July.
Eh bien,
Many thanks. Well, my takeaways are the reassertion of a social market economy, of safety net, a welfare state, which is probably one of the greatest achievements of the EU. And also what you've said about our learning the lessons from the crisis, from a world that has changed, and we need to adapt the EU so that it can be stronger. It's a great message for our listeners, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Cercle des économistes, and see you next year, of course.
It's indeed a pleasure to be with you, hopefully soon in real life.